People believe betrayal comes from strangers. Mine sat at the head of our family table. My name is Harper Quinn, 41, former Army Signals officer, current family outcast. I came to my sister's wedding in a plain black dress, promising I'd keep the peace. I meant it, until I heard my father's voice behind the catering tent, low and sharp, in a dialect I'd only heard in covert rooms. She suspects nothing. Deliver after midnight. One touch to my earring woke the only protocol I still trusted. One word into the mic, and my family's perfect day started to fall apart. The rehearsal dinner was staged like a magazine spread. Linen napkins folded into swans, crystal stemware glowing in amber candlelight, a floral arch positioned just so for the inevitable photos. My seat waited at the far end of the long stone patio table, a single chair without a name card, its leg wobbling on the uneven flagstone. It wasn't an oversight. In my family, nothing social ever is. It was the just-in-case seat, the one you pull out when you're not sure if the sister you barely acknowledge will actually show up. Sloane saw me before I sat down. Her smile was all teeth, polished for the camera, but her eyes had the sharp edge of a blade. "Everyone, this is my sister, Harper," she said in that half-laughing tone reserved for introducing someone you hope people won't look at too closely. She used to be in the military. Now she gardens and listens to old records. The table chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was safe. I didn't bother to return the smile. I scanned the faces instead, lashes blinking too fast, shoulders angled away, champagne flutes tilted like shields. My mother, Elaine, held court 3 seats down, posture perfect, voice lilting as she spun some anecdote for Sloane's friends. The frost beneath her charm was invisible to most, but I'd been reading those layers since childhood. My father, Tom, sat across from me. He was a wall in a tailored suit, hands folded on the tablecloth, saying nothing. But when Sergei Arseny, the groom's father, stepped into the space, I caught it. A flicker in Tom's gaze, quick and precise, as if measuring a man he already knew. Sergei moved with the stillness of someone used to commanding a room without raising his voice. His silver hair gleamed under the lantern light, his eyes scanned like a security sweep. The food arrived in courses, conversation swelled and dipped like tide water. I caught fragments, startup jargon, real estate gossip, curated origin stories about how Sloane met Misha. None of it explained where he'd come from or why his circle seemed built from ghosts. Midway through the second course, I heard it, softer than the scrape of a fork, just behind the swell of laughter. Misha leaning towards Sergei, his voice clipped, syllables rounded in the way I'd only heard in Rostov dialect. My training reacted before my mind did, isolating consonants, passing cadence. I couldn't catch every word over the clink of glasses, but I recognised enough to know it wasn't a casual aside. I glanced toward Tom. His eyes were on his plate, but I noticed the small stillness in him, the way a man stops moving when he's listening to something only he's meant to hear. He didn't look up when Sergei's gaze swept the table, but I did. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, long enough for me to read the message there. We see each other. The night blurred into its performance, toasts about love and destiny, laughter pitched too high, glasses raised to family. I sipped my water, letting the words slide past. Around me, everyone leaned toward the centre, toward the glow. I sat at the edge, in shadow, the invisible sister in the visible family. When dessert came, Sloane lifted her glass. "To family," she said brightly. "The ones who build you up, tear you down, and somehow always show up." A ripple of knowing laughter passed through the table. Her gaze landed on me for the last line, and I felt the unspoken in it. You showed up, but you don't belong. I touched the base of my glass to the table, a silent toast, and let the moment pass. They thought my quiet was surrender. It wasn't. It was a perimeter, and tonight I was already walking it. Family dinners in the Quinn house had always been theatre, and my father the quiet director. Scandal never lasted long. Tom had a way of making things vanish, problems, questions, even people, without ever raising his voice. When my cousin got caught in a credit card scam, the police report disappeared. When my mother's charity was accused of cooking its books, the accountant resigned for health reasons and the press forgot. When it was my turn, it wasn't a scandal in the social pages. It was a classified report from the Cauldron corridor operation, my operation, that went missing. I'd spent 6 weeks embedded under a false identity, tracking arms disguised as medical shipments, until I pulled the thread that revealed something far bigger. I filed it by the book, flagged it red for urgency. The next morning, Tom called me, not to ask what I'd found, not to say he was proud, just, I'll handle it. By the end of the week, my report was downgraded to non-actionable and erased from the secure server. At the time, I told myself it was coincidence, that my father's reach didn't extend into places like that. But the older I got, the harder it was to ignore the pattern. His silence wasn't ignorance. It was currency. Sitting at that wobbling chair during Sloane's rehearsal dinner, I caught him watching me. Not in the open, but through the corner of his eye, like a man assessing damage. It wasn't the look of a parent, relieved to see their child. It was an audit, cold and clinical, measuring how much trouble I could cause if I chose to open my mouth. Between bites of over-seasoned salmon, I kept catching the subtle triangulation. Sergei would murmur something to Misha. Misha would nod without speaking, and Tom's posture would shift. An imperceptible lean, a stilling of his fork, his attention narrowing to their exchange. He never spoke to them directly, not in public. But he didn't need to. His listening was a language of its own, one I'd been fluent in since childhood. I thought of the dinners after Cauldron, when the air between us felt like static. Tom never accused me outright, but he didn't defend me either, when the rest of the family treated my warnings like paranoia. You see shadows where there's light, Elaine had said once, pouring wine with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Tom had only looked at his plate. Now, under the lantern glow of Sloane's perfect evening, I knew better. The shadows I'd seen weren't mine, they were his. When the plates were cleared and the laughter began to blur into background noise, I excused myself. My heels clicked against the flagstone, the night air cooler beyond the spill of light from the patio. In the guest suite upstairs, the quiet felt heavier than the party below. I set my clutch on the dresser, pulled the small, matte black case from its lining. The hinge creaked as I opened it, revealing the earpiece nestled in foam. I hadn't worn it since the day they told me Cauldron was over. I'd kept it anyway, the way some people keep old photographs, proof that a moment happened even if no one else will admit it. I rolled the device between my fingers, feeling the faint ridges, the cool metal warming against my skin. My reflection in the dark window looked like a ghost in the garden lights beyond. Somewhere down there, my father was still at the table, still smiling that unreadable smile, still deciding whether I was a threat worth neutralizing. I slid the earpiece into place. The fit was as familiar as the weight of my own name. I told myself I would keep it silent, that tonight I would be nothing more than a guest in a black dress, a shadow in family photographs. But I also knew this. If I heard something too familiar, something that pulled Cauldron out of the ground where Tom buried it, my silence would end. And when it did, there'd be no putting it back. The Cauldron corridor smelled of diesel and cold iron, the kind of place where shadows outnumbered people. I'd been living there for weeks under the name Ellen Voss, a mid-tier broker in stolen industrial equipment. My hair was dyed black, my accent softened into something vaguely Eastern European, and every conversation I had was measured in risk. Victor was my only in. He was jittery even in calm weather, the kind of man who scanned rooftops before crossing a street. We met in an abandoned shipping warehouse near the Baltic Rail line, both of us standing far enough apart that neither could grab the other without moving first. "You have it?" I asked, in his language, keeping my hands visible. He nodded, producing a small plastic-wrapped object from the inside of his jacket. I recognised the weight before I saw it. The subtle heft of a USB pendant, the same proprietary build I'd only seen in intercepted photos. Capsule-shaped, matte, with a curved end designed to slot into a matching cradle. Not something you buy online. This was custom hardware, the kind you hide because owning it is evidence. I tucked it into my own jacket without ceremony. "Where'd you get it?" His answer was evasive, but names slipped through. A broker in Warsaw, a silent partner in New York, and someone he only called the father. I logged every detail in the mental shorthand I'd trained for. Accent shifts, stress on certain syllables. The pause before he said father, as though it meant something more than family. The data I pulled later from that pendant wasn't just valuable, it was volatile. Coordinates, shipment manifests, payment ledgers that spanned 3 continents. It was the kind of evidence that should have gone straight to the top. I filed my report through encrypted channels, marked it urgent, and sent a duplicate to our forward team in Brussels. The next morning, my secure phone rang. It wasn't my CO. It was Tom. Hearing my father's voice on an op line felt like a wrong note in a familiar song. "I'll handle it," he said. No greeting, no questions. "Handle what?" I kept my tone flat, but my pulse spiked. "Just send the official file and nothing else. Leave the rest out." "That's not how this works." "Harper." His voice sharpened, not raised, but edged. "I'll handle it." Then he hung up. Within 48 hours, my report status changed from priority 1 to non-actionable intelligence. The pendant was logged into evidence but flagged for further review. A week later, it was gone. Victor disappeared 2 days after that. His body turned up months later in a river outside Riga. Back then, I told myself, maybe Tom had pulled strings to protect me. That he'd seen my name on a dangerous file and decided to shield me from whatever fallout was coming. It was easier than believing the alternative, that he was part of the reason the case had been buried. But the more I replayed the conversation, the less it felt like protection. His voice on that call wasn't worried, it was certain. The certainty of someone who already knew what the file contained, who the players were and where the money was going. In the months that followed, I combed through old logs, looking for overlaps between Cauldron and names I knew from home. There weren't many, just one, buried deep in a shipment ledger. A shell company that had donated generously to a civic project my father chaired. It could have been coincidence, but in my world, coincidences are just evidence you haven't finished connecting. Sitting in my hotel room after Sloane's rehearsal dinner, I could still see Victor's eyes the night he handed me that pendant. how he flinched at the sound of a distant door slamming. I could still hear my father's voice on that cold line, as out of place in my operation as frost in July. For years, I'd convinced myself those memories didn't fit together. Now, with Sergei Arseny at my sister's wedding and my father watching me like a loaded weapon across the table, I knew they did. The only question left was how deep the connection ran and whether I was ready to follow it all the way down. The only time Sloane and I ever talked about Cauldron was over lukewarm coffee in my kitchen, months after the case was buried. She'd stopped by unannounced, a rare enough event that I thought something must be wrong. I remember her perching on the edge of a bar stool, immaculate, even in casual clothes. "You know," she said, stirring sugar into her cup, "you have this way of looking at people like they're already guilty." I didn't flinch. And maybe not everyone's hiding a crime, Harper. Maybe some people are just living. The words weren't cruel on their face, but I could hear the weight beneath them. They weren't hers alone. They were echoes of what the rest of the family had been saying behind closed doors. I was paranoid. I was exhausting. I saw rot where there was only paint peeling. "I'm telling you there's a connection," I said then, keeping my voice even. "The people in that file, they weren't random, and I think—" "Stop." She held up a hand, like she was halting a child's tantrum. "I'm not doing this with you. I came here because I wanted to see you, not because I wanted another conspiracy lecture." She finished her coffee in 3 sips, set the cup in the sink without rinsing it, and left without saying goodbye. That was Sloane. Exit clean, no loose ends. After she was gone, I sat in the stillness of the kitchen, staring at the steam fading from her cup. I'd felt alone before, but that day it settled differently. Not just alone, exiled. It was weeks later, packing up a box of old family photographs for storage, when I found the picture. Glossy print, edges curling, buried under decades of birthdays and graduations. The photo had no date stamp. But I knew the era by the cut of my father's suit, the width of his tie. He was standing in front of a building I didn't recognize, smiling as he shook hands with a man whose face was turned 3/4 from the camera. I almost tossed it aside. Just another archive of Tom Quinn shaking hands with some civic donor or political ally. But then my gaze caught on the jawline, the silver-threaded hair, the way the man's stance mirrored the profile I'd memorized from dossiers. Sergei Arseny, or someone who could have been his brother. I felt a shift in my chest, a click like a safe tumbling toward the right combination. The photograph predated Cauldron, had to, given my father's age in it, which meant whatever business brought Sergei into his orbit didn't start with my sister's engagement. I turned the photo over, no inscription, just a faint ring of moisture, as if it had once sat under a glass. For 10 full minutes I stood there holding it, weighing whether to slip it into the family pile or keep it for myself. In the end, I slid it into the small iron box in my closet, the one with the stiff hinge and the faint smell of oil. Inside were the artifacts I couldn't throw away. My worn military ID, a folded map of the Cauldron corridor, a cassette tape marked with a black X. The photograph slid in beside them, face down. I closed the lid and turned the key, feeling the weight of it in my palm. I wasn't ready to look too closely at what it meant, not yet. A piece of me still wanted to believe that my father's handshakes were just handshakes, that the timing was coincidence, that there was some benign explanation I hadn't thought of. But another part, the part that had lived in shadows and listened through walls, knew better. That photo was a fragment of a larger picture I hadn't assembled yet. And the worst part was knowing it had been sitting in our family albums for years, hiding in plain sight. I put the box back on the shelf and walked away, but I could feel the memory of it following me, as if the image had burned into the back of my eyes. The next time I opened that box, I suspected I'd be ready to turn the photo over and face whatever truth it held, just not tonight. The brunch was staged to look effortless. White tablecloths on the terrace, sunlight glinting off polished silverware, champagne poured into endless flutes. The smell of fresh-baked pastries mixed with something sharper, an undercurrent of perfume and expensive cologne. I chose a seat, with my back to the wall, the better to see everyone. Misha was diagonally across from me, leaning back in his chair like a man who owned every angle of the scene. He wore a pale linen shirt, unbuttoned just enough to show a sliver of skin at his collarbone. That's when I saw it. Hanging from a thin black cord was a pendant, small enough to be mistaken for an ornament, but my eyes locked on it the way a soldier locks on a target. Capsule, shape, matte finish, curved end designed to dock into a cradle. I'd last seen one just like it in the Cauldron corridor, sealed in plastic in Victor's shaking hands. I forced my gaze to drift elsewhere, reaching for a glass of water as if nothing had caught my attention. Peripheral vision did the rest. Misha's hand went to the pendant every few minutes, fingers brushing over it in a motion too deliberate to be unconscious, like someone touching a talisman before a leap. To anyone else, it might have looked like a sentimental keepsake, a charm from a loved one, maybe even a piece of bespoke tech for personal use. But I knew better. Hardware like that didn't store wedding vows or family photos. It was designed to hold information people would kill for, wrapped in encryption that burned itself if mishandled. As the brunch conversation floated around me, stories of travel, mutual acquaintances, jokes that belonged to a world I'd never been invited into, I began to map the timeline in my head. If Misha's pendant was the same proprietary build from Cauldron, it meant the network hadn't just survived the operation's shutdown. It had evolved. The part that tightened my chest wasn't just the pendant itself, it was the way Misha wore it openly, here, at a family gathering. That kind of confidence came from believing no one in the room would recognize what it was. He had reason to believe that. Sloane was beside him, laughing at something one of his groomsmen had said, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. She didn't notice the pendant, didn't notice his fingers grazing it like a silent Morse code. Or maybe she did and thought nothing of it. I tracked the way he moved when someone leaned in to speak to him. The tilt of his head, the way his shoulders squared or relaxed depending on the topic. Each time his hand touched the pendant, his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, like he was reassuring himself it was still there. A memory threaded its way to the surface, Victor standing in that freezing warehouse, pressing the pendant into my palm, his voice low when he called it the last key. That was years ago. And yet here it was, swinging gently against the chest of the man about to marry my sister. I let my gaze wander over the rest of the table. My father, Tom, was in conversation with Sergei at the far end. Nothing in his posture suggested strain, but I'd learned to read the subtleties, the slight angle of his chair towards Sergei, the way he seemed to leave space in his sentences for the older man to fill. It wasn't the deference of a stranger, it was familiarity. I buttered a piece of toast I didn't want, nodding occasionally as Sloane's friends traded compliments about the decor. My ears filtered for tone shifts, for the drop in register that often preceded something important. When Misha laughed, I caught it. The faintest, metallic clink as the pendant tapped against one of his shirt buttons. Lifting my glass to take a sip, I covered the movement of my eyes as they returned to the pendant. Same size, same finish, same lethal potential. My instincts weren't screaming yet, but they were wide awake. By the time dessert arrived, some overcomplicated confection with spun sugar, I knew two things for certain. The Cauldron line hadn't gone dead, and whatever was on that pendant, Misha wasn't just protecting it. He was wearing it like a declaration, and if he was bold enough to bring it here, he was either untouchable or thought he was. I waited until Sloane drifted toward the mimosa bar, away from the dense ring of guests around Misha. She was scrolling through her phone, the kind of distracted that only comes when you're checking the curated version of your life against the real one. "You ever wonder where he came from?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, as if I were commenting on the weather. Her eyes didn't lift from the screen. "What are you talking about?" "Misha, the companies he runs, the people he knows, the hardware he wears around his neck like it's lucky." She finally looked at me, frowning. "It's a necklace, Harper. You don't have to turn everything into an op." I took a slow breath. "That's not a necklace you buy in a store. I've seen that build before. It doesn't store vacation photos. Whatever's on it..." "Stop." Her voice sharpened enough to turn a few heads. "You always do this. You take something normal and twist it until it's ugly. This is my wedding, not one of your war stories." Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. "I'm saying be careful. I'm saying mind your business." She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, a hand closed on my arm. Tom. He was composed, but his grip was firm enough to make the message clear. "Walk with me," he said, already steering me toward the far edge of the terrace. We stopped where the potted palms formed a screen from the rest of the guests. His voice was low, colder than I'd ever heard it. "Don't do this. I'm just don't." His eyes were locked on mine, the usual paternal patience gone. "You think you're protecting her. You're not. You're just stirring things you don't understand." The last part landed wrong. "Don't understand" wasn't how he spoke to me, not even when we disagreed. This was something else. Territorial. Almost proprietary. "This isn't just about the wedding," I said slowly. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "It's about keeping this family intact. Don't break it over nothing." Nothing. The word echoed in my head. He'd used the same tone when he told me he'd handle Cauldron. Back then I thought he meant keeping me safe. Now I wasn't so sure. "You're protecting something," I said, "and it's not her." His hand loosened, but he didn't look away. "Walk away, Harper. Let it be." Then he left me standing in the shadow of the palms, the distant chatter of brunch drifting back like it belonged to another world. I stood there for a moment, feeling the shape of his warning settle into place. He wasn't just worried about family embarrassment. He was guarding a transaction, a deal threaded through this wedding like hidden wiring. And if Misha's pendant was part of it, then the thing I'd almost buried with Cauldron had just clawed its way back to the surface. When I returned to my seat, the table was in full swing again, Sloane laughing too brightly at something Misha said, Tom back in conversation with Sergei as if nothing had passed between us. I reached into my clutch under the table, feeling the smooth curve of the matte black case. In the privacy of my lap, I opened it and slid the earpiece into place. The faint static was like the intake of a breath. I kept my face neutral, my posture relaxed. No one at the table looked my way. I set my parameters in my head. No action unless I heard specific markers, delivery, timing, confirmation. My thumb brushed the tiny switch behind my ear, checking the channel. Live. It wasn't an activation. Not yet. But the moment the wrong words crossed the air, I'd be ready. And this time, I wouldn't mistake my father's silence for protection. The ceremony unfolded in curated perfection. White petals scattered across the aisle, a string quartet humming in the background, sunlight catching in the crystal glasses lined along the reception tables. I kept to the edge, half in shadow beneath a pergola wrapped in roses, scanning the scene the way I'd scan a convoy route. Misha stood near the fountain with Sergei, his posture relaxed, head tilted toward his father in quiet conversation. My earpiece was live, tuned to the ambient hum of voices, filtering for cadence more than content. Years of training had taught me that intent comes through tone long before it comes through words. Then I caught it. Deliver after the ceremony, Misha said, his voice pitched low, but with that clipped precision I recognized from Rostov dialect. Sergei murmured something back, too quiet for the mic to catch. A pause, then another voice entered the channel, deeper, colder. My spine went rigid. Use the side exit at midnight. No mistakes. It was my father. The sound was unmistakable. The way he flattened certain vowels, the measured spacing between words, the authority woven into every syllable. I'd heard that tone before, on the Cauldron call, in closed-door family meetings when something had to be buried. But hearing it here, folded into an operational exchange with Misha and Sergei, stripped away the last threads of denial I'd been holding. Tom wasn't an observer. He wasn't reluctantly aware. He was directing. I shifted slightly, angling myself so I could see him without drawing attention. He stood just outside the frame of the photographers, hands clasped loosely behind his back, a man at ease in his own event. But his eyes were on Misha, and there was no mistaking the dynamic. This wasn't the casual familiarity of a future father-in-law. This was command. My pulse stayed steady out of habit, but inside something recalibrated. For years I'd filed my father under complicit by silence. Now I had to move him to a new category entirely, active participant. The guests around me laughed and chatted, oblivious. The officiant was guiding Sloane and Misha through the final vows, voices rising and falling in practiced rhythm. I glanced at my sister, radiant, trusting, completely unaware of the machinery moving beneath her wedding day. In my ear, the ambient noise dipped just enough for me to catch Tom again. Confirm before you hand it off. Misha's reply was a short affirmative in dialect. Sergei said nothing, but I could picture his nod. The phrase, hand it off, was a marker I'd been waiting for. In operational lexicon, it almost always meant a transfer, data, currency, or contraband. Given the pendant at Misha's collar, I could guess which one. A breeze shifted through the pergola, carrying the faint scent of champagne and roses. I kept my hands loose at my sides, resisting the urge to touch the earpiece. The protocol was simple. Gather, verify, act. But this was different. Acting now meant moving against my father, not just an enemy. The officiant's voice swelled for the final pronouncement. Applause was building in the air like distant thunder. I looked toward Tom one last time, hoping to find hesitation in his face, some flicker of doubt that might suggest he was in over his head. There was nothing, just calm, calculated certainty. That certainty was my answer. As the crowd erupted in cheers and the first notes of the recessional began, I stepped back into the shadows of the garden, mind already turning over the next move. My father had placed himself squarely in the centre of this operation. Whatever loyalty I still owed him as a daughter had just been outflanked by the duty I owed to the truth. And if that truth had to be delivered on his daughter's wedding day, so be it. I moved along the edge of the garden, the chatter of guests fading under the rustle of the hedges. The sun was dropping lower, throwing long shadows across the grass. From here, the tented reception looked like a snow globe, perfect and sealed, while just outside its glass walls I was about to crack it open. Under the cover of the floral arch, I touched my earring, feeling the cool metal against my skin. One tap activated the mic channel, 2 taps armed the secure line. My voice was barely a breath when I said it. Perseus! The word vanished into the ether, but I knew where it would land. Protocol Perseus had been dormant for years, a Cold War relic repurposed for joint cyber intel operations. It wasn't a blunt instrument. It was surgical. The moment I spoke it, a specific set of contacts inside FBI and HSI were alerted, along with a liaison node at Europol. No flashing alerts, no alarms, just a quiet convergence of people who understood that one word meant move now. I stayed where I was, scanning the property with the same discipline I'd used on surveillance Overwatch. In less than 2 minutes, I picked out the first arrivals, 2 figures in tailored suits walking casually toward the cocktail area. Their pace unhurried, their eyes cataloguing every face. More followed, scattered, blending into the flow of late arriving guests. They weren't carrying long guns or wearing tactical gear. They didn't need to. My earpiece ticked once, then twice. A female voice, low and clipped. Acknowledged. Units in position. Maintain visual until contact. Copy. I let my gaze drift back to the center of the reception. Misha was leaning toward Sergei, expression unreadable. Sloane was glowing beside him, still high on the ceremony, still believing her day was untouched by anything beyond champagne and roses. Tom was across the tent, shaking hands with a city councilman, laughing in a way that could have been genuine if I didn't know better. And that's when the realization settled like cold iron in my stomach. This wasn't just about Misha or Sergei anymore. The conversation I'd overheard made it clear. Tom wasn't a bystander. He was integrated. Which meant that when the net closed, he could be standing in it too. My training kept my pulse steady, but there was no training for this exact calculus. The father who taught me to ride a bike and to keep my back straight at the dinner table, now possibly in the same operational category as the men I'd chased across borders. I told myself the same thing I told rookies in the field: focus on the mission parameters. Objective 1 was safety, no civilian casualties, no panicked stampede. Objective 2 was containment. Objective 3 was secure custody. Whether that custody extended to my father wasn't mine to decide once the protocol was active. Still, my eyes kept finding him in the crowd. The way he moved from group to group, always circling back toward Sergei. The faint nods they exchanged when they passed too close to be coincidence. The shift in Tom's weight when he was listening, not talking. The voice in my ear came again. Window opens in 55. Confirmed at midnight exit. Hold until signal. I exhaled slowly, anchoring myself in the moment. I wasn't here to make arrests. I was here to make sure the right people were in place when the time came. My part was already done. Perseus had been spoken. The rest was execution. And yet, as I stood there in the garden's shadow, the truth pressed against me like a loaded weapon. By setting this in motion, I hadn't just brought the law down on a pair of foreign operatives. I'd possibly drawn a target on my own blood. I straightened my shoulders and stepped back toward the reception, merging into the flow of guests with a flute of sparkling water in my hand. From the outside, I was just another attendee, smiling faintly at the music, nodding to familiar faces. Inside, I was a fuse already lit, counting down in silence. Whatever happened next, there was no unlighting it. The first sign was the shift in the air. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, laughter thinned, the quartet's music wavered, as if the violinists had sensed something coming before anyone else did. I saw it in the reflection on the tense glass panels, 2 men in dark suits moving in tandem toward the fountain, where Misha and Sergei stood like the centerpieces of a living display. Then the operation unfolded with the precision of clockwork. No raised voices, no weapons drawn, just the fluid choreography of people who'd rehearsed this 100 times. An agent in a slate grey blazer reached Sergei first, one hand firm on his shoulder, the other flashing a badge low and close. Misha turned instinctively, only to find his path blocked by a second agent stepping out from behind a pillar. It took less than 3 seconds for both of them to be under control, wrists secured, feet spread, posture neutralized. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by the inevitable swell of murmurs. And then movement on the periphery. Tom. He stepped forward from the edge of the reception, expression set in that calm, commanding mask I'd seen my whole life. To anyone else, it might have looked like he was going to intervene on behalf of his future son-in-law, maybe to de-escalate. But I knew that walk. It was the same stride he used when he intended to take control of a room. He didn't get the chance. A third agent materialized from the mingling guests, positioning himself between Tom and the scene at the fountain. His hand didn't touch Tom, but the placement was unmistakable. A barrier, a signal. The message was clear. You're not part of this. For the briefest moment, Tom's eyes shifted past the agent and found mine across the lawn. There was no flash of anger there, no wide-eyed shock at what was happening, only a steady, unblinking acknowledgement. It wasn't even resignation. It was the look of a man who had calculated the odds and found them closing in, a man who knew the outcome before the first move was made. It hit me harder than I expected, that absence of surprise. This wasn't a man caught off guard. This was a man who'd known the risk and played anyway, and now he was silently conceding the game. Somewhere to my left, Sloane's voice broke through the low hum of the crowd. "What is happening?" Her heels clicked too fast against the flagstone as she pushed forward, eyes wide and frantic. She reached Misha just as an agent was guiding him away, her hands clutching at his arm. "Stop, he didn't do anything. This is insane." Misha didn't look at her. He kept his gaze forward, the muscles in his jaw tight, the pendant at his collar glinting once in the sunlight before disappearing into the crowd. Elaine stood frozen near the champagne table, one hand gripping the stem of her glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, eyes darting between Tom, the agents, and me. She didn't move toward either of us, as if distance could keep the scene from touching her. The music had stopped entirely now, replaced by the layered sounds of authority, clipped instructions from agents, the shuffle of feet against stone, the rustle of onlookers shifting for a better view. Tom didn't break eye contact until the agent in front of him gave a subtle tilt of the head, guiding him a step back. Even then, his gaze lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if to make sure I understood. He knew exactly who had set this in motion, and he wasn't going to contest it. Around us, the curated world of the wedding day was collapsing. Overturned chairs, spilled drinks, petals trampled into the grass. But in that moment, all I could see were my father's eyes, steady, stripped of pretense, and, for the first time, admitting without words that I had won. As the agents turned Misha toward the garden gate, he caught sight of me standing under the pergola. For a heartbeat, the noise of the crowd seemed to thin, and his expression shifted, recognition cutting through the chaos. "Vesper," he said, just loud enough for me to hear. The name was a ghost from another life. The code name I'd carried through Cauldron, buried with the operation and never spoken in this world. Hearing it now was like a wire snapping somewhere deep in my chest. He knew exactly who had unspooled the thread beneath his feet. Sloane's gaze followed his, tracing the invisible line between us. "You," she said, her voice cracking like glass under heat. She closed the distance in 3 quick steps, her heels biting into the grass. "You did this." Her face was flushed, eyes wet but hard. "You didn't just ruin my wedding, you betrayed him." She jabbed a finger toward Misha. "And you betrayed Dad." I didn't look at her. My eyes were on Tom. He stood where the agent had left him, hands loosely at his sides, watching without intervening. There was no denial on his face, no attempt to tell Sloane she was wrong, no defense for me either, just that same steady, unreadable gaze. It was then I understood the full shape of his silence. It wasn't absence, it wasn't uncertainty, it was a weapon. He'd used it my whole life to control a room, to let others fill the void with whatever suited him. It had protected him, shielded him, and, when necessary, condemned without saying a word. Now he was using it again. Sloane's voice rose, drawing the attention of guests still frozen in place. "You've been trying to tear this family apart for years, and now you've finally done it. Are you happy?" I finally looked at her. Her makeup was smudged at the corners, her veil askew from the rush toward Misha. "No," I said quietly, "but I'm not sorry." She recoiled as if I'd slapped her. "You don't even deny it." "What's the point?" I asked, my voice even. "Dad's not denying anything either." Her head whipped toward Tom, desperate for him to contradict me, to tell her she was right. But he stayed still, eyes on me, lips pressed in a line that was neither approval nor condemnation. It hit her then. Maybe not the whole truth, but enough of it. The crease between her brows deepened, and her hands dropped from their clenched fists to hang limply at her sides. "I don't even know who you are," she whispered. "You know exactly who I am," I said. "You just don't like what that means." Her eyes filled again, but she didn't answer. She turned away sharply, retreating toward Elaine, who still hadn't moved from her post by the champagne table. My mother reached for her, wrapping her in a one-armed embrace, while keeping her gaze fixed on me, as though memorizing the distance between us. The agents were moving Misha and Sergei out of sight now, their path shielded by a knot of suits. Guests had started to murmur again, the initial shock giving way to speculation. Somewhere behind me, a chair toppled over in the grass. I looked back at Tom one last time. We stood across a gulf that had always been there, though today it was visible to everyone. In that space, I saw the truth I'd been circling for years. His silence was both the shield he hid behind and the blade he wielded when he wanted to cut someone out. Today, he'd chosen not to use it to protect me. And in doing so, he'd told me more than any confession could. The bottom dropped out of my stomach, but alongside the ache was something sharper, clarity. Whatever came next, the pretense was gone. The truth had shape now, and it wasn't going back into the dark. As I turned to leave the pergola, the air seemed heavier, the chatter of the guests dim and distant. My family had just turned its back on me in full daylight. But for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I stood. By morning, the wedding wasn't a wedding anymore. It was content. The first video hit my phone just after sunrise, sent by a number I didn't recognise. Grainy, shot from behind a hedge, it caught the exact moment the agents closed in on Misha and Sergei. The clip zoomed shakily toward the fountain, lingering on Sloane's scream, then panning past Tom, standing still as the world shifted around him. By noon, the footage was everywhere. News outlets blurred the faces, but social media didn't bother. Hashtags bloomed and mutated by the hour. Wedding raid? Sister or spy? Black dress betrayal. The comments were worse. She couldn't stand to let her sister be happy. Daddy issues gone nuclear. If this isn't the most American family drama I've ever seen. They wrote like they'd been there, like they knew me. I didn't read them for long. Instead, I found myself at the hotel bar just after lunch. The place was half empty, all muted lighting and soft jazz piped through ceiling speakers. I took a seat at the far end, away from the windows, and ordered ginger ale. I wanted the burn without the fog. The bartender was a middle-aged man with the kind of calm that comes from years of hearing strangers' confessions. He set the glass down without comment, but after a moment he nodded toward the phone on the bar. The paused frame showed me, hand to my earring, in the seconds before the operation moved in. "That you?" he asked, voice neutral. I didn't answer right away. Then, yeah, his eyes flicked back to the screen. "Was it worth it?" I took a sip, letting the ginger fizz settle on my tongue. It was necessary. He studied me for a second, then nodded like he'd just filed something away. Fair enough. We didn't speak again. I was halfway through my drink when someone passed behind me, close enough that their shadow cut across the bar. A woman's voice, low and deliberate, brushed my ear. "Good work." I turned, but she was already walking away, older, maybe in her 60s, wearing a navy coat and carrying a shopping bag. She didn't look back. For a moment, I just sat there, watching her disappear through the revolving door. The words were simple, but they landed with more weight than any of the online noise. She didn't ask for an explanation, didn't want a story. She'd already decided. I drained the rest of my drink and signalled for the check. Outside, the afternoon light was thin and cold, the kind that makes everything look like a photograph. People passed on the sidewalk, glancing at me and then away, maybe recognising me, maybe just sensing I was part of something they'd seen on a screen. Back in my room, I muted my phone and set it face down. The silence was a relief, but it was temporary. I knew the story wouldn't fade right away. The internet doesn't work like that. For now, though, I let the quiet in, the way you let a wound breathe before you cover it again. The city below carried on, traffic lights changing, buses groaning to stops, someone laughing too loudly in the street. I stood by the window, the hotel glass reflecting my face back at me. It didn't look like the woman in the clips, the one strangers were building headlines around. It looked like someone older, maybe a little more hollowed out, but still here. Necessary. The word looped in my head, not as justification, but as a simple fact. It wasn't clean, it wasn't pretty, but it had been the only choice. And no amount of hashtags was going to change that. The rattle started late that night, somewhere between the 4th and 5th anonymous messages buzzing my phone. I'd muted every alert, but the vibration still bled through the nightstand, low and insistent. I ignored it for a while until curiosity outpaced the comfort of silence. It wasn't another clip or insult this time, it was a link. I tapped it, and a grainy PDF opened, scanned pages from a classified dossier I hadn't seen in years. The header read, Cauldron, Supplemental Persons of Interest. The first few pages were the same as I remembered. Aliases, suspected shell companies, cross-border financial transfers. But then came the new material. A still frame from a surveillance photo, faces half obscured by shadow. One of them was Sergei, younger but unmistakable. Beside him, the outline of another man, taller, squarer shoulders, his face blurred by motion. Even through the grain, the cut of the suit, the set of the jaw, and the sweep of the hair were familiar in a way that twisted in my gut. Tom. The caption beneath didn't name him. It just read, Unconfirmed domestic contact, US origin, possible operational liaison. The file ended there, but it didn't have to say more. Anyone who'd known him for more than 5 minutes could connect the dots. And now it was loose in the wild, being passed hand to hand in encrypted chats, the way dangerous truths always travel first. Quietly, then all at once. By morning, the image had made its way into the same feeds that had been tearing me apart for days. The comments shifted tone, not in my favour exactly, but with a new edge of curiosity. The neat story of the rogue sister ruining a wedding was beginning to fray. I didn't rush to seize on it. I'd learned a long time ago that you don't force a revelation. You let it breathe until it speaks for itself. Around noon, the envelope arrived. Hotel stationery slid under my door, my name written in a hand I recognised before I bent to pick it up. Sloane's handwriting had always been sharp, impatient, like she was in a hurry to get the words out before they spoiled. I opened it, half expecting venom, half preparing for some theatrical demand. It was neither. Harper, I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about him. There was nothing else. No apology for the years of distance, no request to talk, no plea to fix what couldn't be fixed. Just the facts as she'd come to see them, stripped down to the bone. I read it twice, then folded the paper back along its original crease. My first instinct was to respond, to acknowledge the crack in her certainty, to leave a line open. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew that wasn't what this was for. Her letter wasn't an invitation. It was a marker, a stake in the ground on her side of the line. She'd put it down, and now it was my choice whether to cross it. I slid the envelope into my bag without answering. Silence this time wasn't surrender, it was control. The day moved on. I walked the city streets, anonymous in the tide of people, the air sharp with the smell of winter coming early. I passed a newsstand where the tabloids had already picked up the Cauldron leak, pairing the blurry image with headlines full of question marks. No one stopped me. No one shouted my name or asked for a photo. The frenzy was shifting, as it always does, chasing fresher blood. But here and there, I caught looks, longer than casual, eyes flicking from my face to their private memory of the story. Back in the hotel, I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window, watching headlights string across the bridge in steady lines. I thought about the letter again, about the weight of those few sentences. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something rarer, recognition. That was enough for now. Out there, strangers were beginning to see pieces of the truth, not the whole of it, maybe not even the dangerous parts, but enough to blur the old story they'd been sold. The narrative was no longer theirs to control, not Tom's, not Misha's, not even mine entirely. I let the quiet settle, the kind that comes after a long, hard push. The city kept moving outside, indifferent to the cracks opening under certain names. And in the stillness, I felt the needle move just slightly upward. Not toward vindication, but toward a place where the truth could breathe on its own. For the first time since the wedding, I believed it might actually get there. The first frost had come early that year, curling the edges of the basil leaves and dusting the garden beds with white. I pulled on gloves and set about cutting back what could be saved, the air sharp in my lungs. Dirt under my fingernails had always grounded me in a way nothing else could. More than running, more than meditation, more than the soft weight of a blanket on a sleepless night. From the porch, Nina Simone drifted from an old record player, her voice slow and rich, threading through the cold air. I let it spill into the yard, the sound mixing with the rustle of dead leaves. When the beds were cleared, I went inside, stripping off my gloves and heading for the small closet at the back of the hall. The iron box was where I'd left it, heavy and cold even after all these months. The hinge squeaked when I opened it, revealing the curated fragments of a life I no longer lived. My worn military ID, the folded map of the Cauldron corridor, a cassette tape marked with a single black X. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out Sloane's letter. The paper was already softened at the folds, edges worn from being handled more than I'd admit. I read it one more time, those 2 sentences, spare and unadorned, and then laid it gently on top of the map. The lid clicked shut, the lock turning with a finality that felt less like an ending and more like a seal. I put the box back on the shelf, sliding it behind an old shoebox no one would ever open. I was halfway down the hall when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Unknown number, but with the area code from the county detention facility. I let it ring once before answering. There was a short delay, the hollow sound of a line connecting. Then his voice. "Harper." I didn't say anything. "I'm not sorry," Tom said. His tone was steady, unhurried, as if we were discussing the weather. "I did what I thought was necessary, and I'd do it again." I leaned against the counter, the cold edge pressing into my hip. "But," he added, and for the first time his voice dipped, not in regret, but in something closer to weight. I saw it in his eyes. Sergei, when they took him, I saw it and I knew. He didn't specify what he'd seen, fear, guilt, the reflection of himself, but I understood. It was the closest he'd ever come to admitting the truth, the closest he'd come to saying I hadn't been wrong. The line clicked, the connection severed by some unseen hand on the other end. I stood there for a while, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space he'd left. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the last dry leaves against the glass. Nina Simone's voice trailed off as the record reached its end, replaced by the faint, steady scratch of the needle. I crossed the room to lift it, setting the arm back at the start. The music began again, warm and low, and I let it fill the kitchen. I thought about the garden, the frost, the sealed box in the closet, about my father's voice and the unspoken space between his words. It wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. The Saturday market was in full swing by the time I arrived. The air was crisp, touched with the smell of apples and wood smoke, the chatter of vendors carrying over the hum of the crowd. Stalls were lined with late-season produce, squash, onions, bundles of fresh herbs tied with twine. I moved slowly, letting myself drift with the tide of people. A woman at the flower stall handed me a bunch of eucalyptus without asking if I wanted it. "It's a good scent for the house," she said. I paid, without bargaining, the silver coins cold in my palm. At the far end of the market, near the stand that sold fresh bread, I felt it. That subtle shift when someone's gaze holds a fraction too long. I turned slightly, enough to see a man in his 30s, hands full with bags of groceries. He didn't stop, didn't approach, just gave me a short, deliberate nod before moving on. No words, no explanation. But it landed in my chest with quiet weight. Recognition, not curiosity. I kept walking. The bakery was warm, the air thick with the smell of yeast and cinnamon. I bought a small loaf and tucked it into my bag. People brushed past, not knowing, not needing to. I wasn't the woman from the viral clip here, not to them. I was just another face in the crowd, choosing vegetables, weighing fruit, smelling herbs before buying. That anonymity felt like a gift. For so long, my life had been defined by extremes. Intense focus under pressure, the cold hum of surveillance rooms, the sharp heat of being accused or dismissed. Now, each ordinary exchange was its own form of defiance. No one here needed to know my history for me to exist fully in this moment. By the time I reached the edge of the market, my bag was heavier than I'd planned. Bread, herbs, root vegetables, the eucalyptus stems poking out like green flags. I stopped by the stone wall that overlooked the river, setting the bag down to rest my hands. The water moved slow and dark under the weak sun. I thought about the nod from the man with the groceries, about the older woman in the hotel bar who had whispered good work, about Sloane's letter folded away in the iron box with the map of Cauldron. These were not parades or medals. They weren't public statements or headlines that vindicated me. They were small, unasked-for moments of acknowledgement, the kind that arrive without fanfare and leave you warmer than you expected. I picked up my bag and started back toward the parking lot, the path lined with turning leaves. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't waiting for anyone to clear my name. Not the media, not the family, not even Sloane. That need had fallen away in pieces over the past weeks, replaced by something steadier. The understanding that the people who mattered already knew, and the rest didn't need to. The drive home was quiet. I kept the radio off, letting the hum of the engine and the sound of tyres on the road fill the space. When I pulled into the driveway, the late afternoon light was spilling gold across the garden beds I'd cleared the day before. Inside, I set the bag on the counter, arranged the eucalyptus in a jar of water, and sliced the bread. Jazz filled the kitchen again, low and easy, the notes curling around the edges of the day. Standing there, I felt the shape of my life now. Smaller in scale maybe, but wide open in ways it hadn't been in years. No missions, no codes, no watching my back in every mirror. Just the next meal, the next planting, the next morning. I didn't need the noise of recognition anymore. The quiet was enough. And if you're listening to this now, wherever you are, I have one question for you. What are you hearing in your own silence?